It's a film that won 3 Oscars. It's a film that shows a model of a building for 5 minutes and 13 seconds. Still shorter than Adrian Brody's Oscar-winning speech. It's a film that got me begging for another hit of the horns. But most of all, this is a film that is very excited to call itself The Brutalist. Because to someone who doesn't know architecture, they might say, oh, he engages in brutality. But to a person who knows architecture, they might say, oh, he engages in brutality. That was actually a hack joke, because for the past 50 years, people have been pretty much repeating the same joke about brutalism. Brutalism was an architectural style from the 1950s to the 1980s, and in the United Kingdom, it was used for a lot of social housing and public buildings. You see more examples in the United States starting in the late 60s, and you're going to feel bad for these buildings when you read the criticism. Now, I don't know if architectural critics would have called the building we follow during the Brutalist ugly, because A, it's hard to define this building as brutalist, and B, we never see the completed building. Uh-oh, does that mean this is the end of the video? No, not if you're a nerd. First, I must give a brief overview of a long movie, The Brutalist. This is Laszlo Toth. It's 1940, he is Hungarian and Jewish, and has survived a concentration camp. Before the war, he was an architect. He makes his way to Ellis Island and then directly to Philadelphia, where he works at his cousin's furniture store. They get commissioned to decorate a library for a rich family. Laszlo makes a modernist masterpiece. All the bookcases have doors that open together, and in the center is a lounge chair that looks like a place you might get a tooth pulled. He's putting the finishing touches on the room when, the dad of this family comes home in a rage. This was a surprise present from his children, and it appears the surprise is going over in a scary, violent way. I sure hope scary violent isn't a theme, so you'll have to watch the movie to find out. He also doesn't pay the bill for the project. Laszlo and his cousin cut all ties when this all goes down. Then he's just working in a coal plant until Mad Rich Man comes back, but surprise, he's not mad anymore. The library got him featured in Look magazine, and now he's searching for its creator. He's been stalking him and made up a folder of his past work, which I believe would have been very hard to do in 1942. It's at this diner we find out that Laszlo was a student at Bauhaus and built many buildings in Budapest. And Mad, now happy rich man wants him to build another. I wonder what style it'll be in. Now, before we actually look at the folder with this building and compare it to real buildings, I want to explain why it's such a big deal that he went to Bauhaus. Bauhaus was a German art school which brought together all forms of art so each could influence the others. That meant architecture, pottery, typography, textiles, furniture were all happening under the same flat roof. Now, I mentioned that chair in the center of Mr. Van Buren's library, which feels very Bauhaus, because you couldn't step foot in that school without making a chair that would be hard to get out of. If only there was a way for us to rest our weary butts and learn about Bauhaus. Oh, I know, we'll let the chairs coach us. Coach us. Hey, so I was invented in 1920 by Walter Gropius. The name sounds bad, but he was never gropey to us. He was the founder of Bauhaus School. He passed it on to this foldable frame over here. Yeah, I fold up. I'm a director's chair, and the guy who made me, Hannes Meyer, became the second director of the Bauhaus School. He was chosen when Walter Gropius left, but he got accused by the mayor, who probably sat in a lame-ass chair, of being a communist and was forced to step down. I'm the MR chair created by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He was the third director. The school was threatened for closure by the Nazi Party. The school was moved to Berlin, but because of pressure from the Nazi Party, again, it voluntarily shut down. He was the third and final director of Bauhaus and ended up following Gropius to the United States. Also, I have a younger brother chair that I think you've met before. Hey, yeah, my creator is also Mies van der Rohe and also Lily Reich. The couch of me is in Edward Cullen's house in Twilight, so you guys might remember me from that. Not to brag, but I wasn't made by a director, but I'm still super famous. I'm made by Marcel Breuer. I don't want to say too much, because you're going to hear about him later, and I want you to stay surprised and excited. Well, wasn't that a helpful set of seats with such a beautiful range of voices? Back to those early photos we see of Laszlo's work at the diner. They are very helpful in trying to understand what type of style Laszlo is part of. He mentions his buildings in Budapest, and we can see in the photos of his work they are straight lines, geometric curves, and have a lack of embellishment. If only there were real Hungarian architects with a similar background and time period who we could compare this fictional architect to. Oh yeah, there are. Farkas Molnár and Marcel Breuer both were students at Bauhaus and were both born in Pécs, the same city this fictional article says Laszlo Toth was born in. Very grateful this article is written like a German Wikipedia entry, because we know that this character was born in January 1901. For comparison, Farkas Molnár was born in 1897, Marcel Breuer in 1902. But I think both of these real architects can show us different journeys. Farkas Molnár spent his career in Hungary. Nearly all of his buildings are in Budapest, and he was considered an extremely creative and inventive designer. The book East European Modernism describes his style. Molnár never received major commissions except houses and apartment buildings, but his houses represent the highest level of achievement. In spite of their small scale, they are paradigms of the pristine modern. And that inventiveness had clearly appeared when he was at Bauhaus, when he had created the drawings and the model for the Red Cube in 1922. It was intended to be a prefabricated structure that could be industrially produced. Now, he was not Jewish, but was still in a dangerous position. In 1932, he had organized an exhibition titled New Architecture, House City Society. It was confiscated because of its revolutionary tone. He was sentenced to a month in prison. He would later be removed from the Chamber of Engineers for years, to later be reinstated. He did not survive World War II. He was killed during the Siege of Budapest in 1945 at the apartment he designed and built and lived in on Karolyi Street. This is a translated quote from a lecture by Balázs Darday in 2007. Farkas Molnár could have gone several times. At the age of 20, he could have stayed with one of the Bauhaus masters, but still came home to finish his studies at the Technical University. Then, around the age of 40, Gropius encouraged him to settle in America, where Breuer built a spectacular global career, building numerous houses, including countless public buildings. Farkas Molnár ended up staying here, even during World War II. Now that quote mentions Marcel Breuer. He was the other real-life Hungarian architect born in Pécs. He was Jewish, but renounced his faith to marry fellow Bauhaus graduate and scientist Marta Earps. At Bauhaus, he had specialized in interiors and furniture, and was the designer of the Vasily chair. Remember that strappy seat with a sumptuous voice? For much of his early career, he was in step with his mentor, Walter Gropius. It was by his request that Marcel Breuer moved out of Germany and later out of Europe. He would work under Gropius at Harvard, and they would design multiple houses together, until he set out on his own in the late 1940s. But for our learning purposes, the thing about Marcel Breuer's work is it had phases, and he lived long enough and was popular enough to have a wide variety of work, which you can follow through the stylistic evolutions in architecture. He began with the white boxes, like so many Bauhaus architects did, and then moved into wooden glass, then concrete panels in big institutional buildings, and finally to shape concrete in geometric patterns that might be best defined as brutalist. That's right, the name of the movie. Which brings us to the final part of our comparison, Laszlo Toth. He is not real, but his fictional story says he studied at Bauhaus, became a professor, married his journalist wife, survived a concentration camp, moved to Philadelphia, was designing a bowling alley while working manual labor, had a drug addiction. His life did not have much opportunity until he was brought under this wealthy man's wing, who allowed him to create this big project with many strings and much abuse attached. But the thing I struggled with in this movie is it wanted Laszlo to both have nothing and everything. They wanted him to be shoveling coal when he meets his wealthy benefactor. They wanted him to be a man that had everything taken from him, just to take more. During his diner chat with Van Buren, he is asked, "Why is an accomplished foreign architect shoveling coal here in Philadelphia?" Laszlo responds to the larger idea of why he's here. "The Reich rejected myself and my colleagues for our type of work, for it was deemed not Germanic in character." But the part that is tripping me up here is my colleagues. Many of the people he would have trained under at Bauhaus had moved to the United States after the school's closure. Bauhaus was open for 14 years, and 1,300 students went through it. There was a professional network that he was part of. If he was building structures previously, he would have been known. The name Bauhaus was known, but having that network would have meant the film couldn't exploit his character as easily. In this story, there is no network of Hungarians or Jewish people or fellow architects who could give him any opportunities. Instead, the wealthy American Van Buren needs to be his only avenue to survival and ultimately creation. And that creation is the Van Buren Institute, which he is asked to build on a hill in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. It is intended to include an auditorium, a gymnasium, a library, and a chapel. Due to funding, it seems like the chapel becomes the main focus. Now, this feels like as good a time as any to let you know that this hill is not in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. The majority of the film was filmed in Hungary. And while watching the film, I hadn't read anything yet, I knew it wasn't in the United States just because of how that Van Buren mansion looked. It's a mansard roof, which I've talked about many times before, but it wouldn't be a second empire, which is the way it's most often seen in North America, but more likely part of the Beaux Arts style that was originally advocated for by architects who'd studied at France's École des Beaux-Arts. It was a style that spread through France and throughout Europe and then to the Americas. Now this feels hard to explain or prove, but to me, I just felt like the ratio of wall to window didn't look like the Beaux Arts mansions that I've seen in the United States. The windows are smaller and there's less of them compared to the expansive stone walls. When I look at the same style of mansion in the United States, I notice more windows, bigger ones, and so many details and flourishes. But this helps us explain something about architecture. Location, time period, architect really matter when you're trying to categorize a style. Beaux Arts has the benefit that it was popular over 100 years ago, and most of its prominent designers had traveled to France to try and import the style here. Then you get this distinct interpretation of the style in the United States, which finds a place within architectural history. It looks different than the things that came before it and what came after it, and we've had time to properly understand where it fits in the historical architectural canon. Brutalism is a little bit fresher. Its name was chosen by its early designers, co-opting the term New Brutalism in the UK from Swedish architectural circles. It was connected by early commentators to the French term béton brut, meaning raw concrete. But if you find yourself on our brutalism, good luck, you will see a never-ending debate. Someone posts a concrete building and then the fighting in the comments begins. Or a tag is casually added saying, not brutalist, questionable brutalist. But that fight happening in the comments is because a building's definition is dependent on all those factors I mentioned before. The time period, the location, the architect. A building from 2004 built in concrete is not brutalist. The United Kingdom was where it originated in social housing that was deeply needed after World War II. It's less commonly seen on smaller residences, but instead housing projects, institutions, universities, libraries, public works, city halls. The title was self-proclaimed by Alison and Peter Smithson. Erno Goldfinger, another Hungarian-born architect, and the namesake behind the James Bond villain, created many famous brutalist buildings in the UK. In the United States, Washington, D.C. got many brutalist buildings, including the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, designed by Marcel Breuer. Remember him? It was described as 10 floors of basement. Now, I wish I could compare these buildings with the building in the Brutalist, but we never see the completed building. We see the model and the floor plans and dark images that pass by as the building is explored at night. I could be lazy and say the building in the Brutalist isn't brutalist because it isn't real. We never see the whole thing. It wasn't made by an actual architect, and it's outside of the timeline. According to a descriptive panel at the commemorative event for Laszlo, we see it was built between 1953 and 1973. Considering fictional Laszlo Toth's final drawings were completed in 1953, and the majority of that timeline was the extensive delay in having it finished, that's very early for a brutalist building in the United States, and honestly, anywhere. One of the earliest examples in the US is Rudolph Hall on Yale's campus, built in 1963. And possibly the main factor for why I wouldn't call it brutalist is it doesn't look brutalist. It is concrete though. The basement reservoir thing reminds me of the work of Felix Candela in Mexico City. The towers and the building expanding around the chapel remind me of the work of Pennsylvania architect Louis Kahn. The exterior concrete finish is reminiscent of Le Corbusier. But my main issue is the interior we see doesn't really match the exterior of the model. It kind of feels like a building built backwards. They wanted him to seem like a genius for using the sun to light up the chapel. They wanted the cool cement slats to connect to the bookcases he designed in the library. They wanted to have those cool underground shots that would be scary and mysterious. In some conversations, Brady Corbet, the film's director and co-writer, has compared making a film to making a building. In the Venn diagram, I think that there's a lot of overlap between architecture and making a movie. It comes from a place of obsession. It comes from a place of real stubbornness. Now I know there's a lot of obsessed architects, and I'm sure there's a lot of stubborn ones too. But I think where this film's building fails is how it doesn't understand what architecture really is. It's building a place that people have to be in. A film is a beautiful piece of art, but people don't have to live inside of it. They get to watch it, visit it. They don't have to go there every day or every week. I mentioned Louis Kahn. He was a great architect who built many buildings. He has a famous quote about the sun that I love. The sun never knew how great it was until it struck the side of a building. He built the first Unitarian church in Rochester, New York, and he discussed his process. I was first drawn to this specific building because it had a sanctuary in it, and his sketches reminded me a bit of the floor plan Laszlo drew, which we see at the end of the film instead of a photo. Louis Kahn talks about presenting his original idea to the congregation. My first design solution, which followed, was a completely symmetrical square. The building provided for the schoolrooms around the periphery. The corners were punctuated by larger rooms. The space in the center of the square harbored the sanctuary and the ambulatory. This design closely resembled the diagram on the blackboard, and everyone liked it until the particular interests of every committee member began to eat away at the rigid geometry. That is a quote of his abridged version of what happened, but this project almost didn't break ground. His design was over budget, and there were complaints about the layout. He received letters from the chair of the building committee. We remained steadfast in the conclusion that we must have an entirely new concept. And he did. He removed a floor and changed the layout. He said, "It is the role of design to adjust to the circumstantial. The final design does not correspond to the first design, though the form held." In his mind, he retained his original concept of the form, but instead of a symmetrical square, it was elongated. He compromised with the people who would be using that building daily. It's in the next paragraph that I think he perfectly sums up the issue you face when comparing a piece of art to a building. Giotto was a great painter because he painted the skies black for the daytime, and he painted birds that couldn't fly and dogs that wouldn't run, and he made men bigger than doorways because he was a painter. A painter has this prerogative. He doesn't have to answer to the problems of gravity, nor to the images as we know them in real life. As a painter, he expresses a reaction to nature, and he teaches us, through his eyes and his reactions, to the nature of man. Architecture has limits. A painter can paint square wheels on a cannon to express the futility of war. A sculptor can carve the same square wheels, but an architect must use round wheels. Though painting and sculpture play a beautiful role in the realms of painting and sculpture, one does not have the same discipline as the others. One may say that architecture is the thoughtful making of spaces. It is, note, the filling of areas prescribed by the client. It is the creating of spaces that evoke a feeling of appropriate use. So this tape discussion from 1961, I think, better sums up the issues I have with this film from 2024 than I could. The director of a film isn't making a real building. Every decision you make can be because it looks good or symbolizes something. The Brutalist seems to be venerating this idea of never altering your ideas, forcing through your vision even if it reduces the likelihood of it ever getting made. Brady Corbet said this was the same film he envisioned 7 years ago. It's exactly the same. There's not a single scene that didn't end up in the film. There's not even a shot that didn't end up in the film. The film is really the screenplay just executed. And although I think that might be an astounding accomplishment for a screenwriter or a director, it doesn't sound realistic for a building. And it certainly wasn't realistic that the building Laszlo started construction on in 1953 was ever finished, especially 20 years later. The building in the Brutalist serves its purpose as a building in film. It is meant to be a triumph, a victory that came with personal losses but no compromises to the structure. And in that way, this building seems to be a better metaphor for the making of this specific film than the making of a real, actual building. Because what makes real buildings really great is when they're made with people in mind, and when you can see them in their entirety, and when people can actually go inside of them. Thank you all for watching this video. I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons. They are how these videos get made, and if you've ever considered joining, you can try out a free membership for a newsletter, or get all the offerings at $3, $5, and beyond. I make these videos on YouTube every month, and Patreon also gets their own video every month. Okay, thank you. Bye.